Welcome to the Continuous Delivery Podcast. I'm solo hosting today, Zarar here, but I'm joined by a very special guest, Paul Henman, who's an agile coach that I have worked with in the past and learned a lot from, and really enjoyed spending our time together at some clients we were at together. Welcome, Paul.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
So we were talking offline before. About Kanban in general, because
hmm
I think I see on LinkedIn a lot of posts flying by that I've gotten this certification, that certification, and I've sort of lost track on what the certifications are, whether they be Scrum or Kanban or what have you. So I thought I'd get you on because you recently have completed a bunch of stuff about Kanban in at the Kanban University, I believe the website is
Yeah, that's it.
Kanban.university. Yep. And you've done the team Kanban Practitioner, Kanban System Design, Kanban System Improvement. You've done all three. So who better to talk to about whether these things are who are they, who they are good for, and who they might not be good for. So let's start off with the first thing you took was, I'm guessing, the team Kanban Practitioner.
Um, Actually, for me, it was slightly out of order just because of the way the courses were.
What is the order? Like, what is the hierarchy here?
Yeah, so Team Kanban Practitioner, TKP is kind of the intro to Kanban. So that I think is a good starting point if you're used to Scrum or nothing at all. If you're just getting into Kanban, you've heard the name, but really haven't dabbled, haven't done a lot of research, TKP is a good place to start. It gives you sort of the basic of what Kanban is, which is a lot more than most people think.
What do you think most people think Kanban is? And if
Well,
you take the
yeah.
TKP course, what would you come out of it thinking Kanban is? Like, what would be the change or the shift in your thinking about, before and after taking that course?
I think a lot of people, especially if you start with Scrum, you think Kanban is the board, and that's the totality of Kanban. It's a board that starts with to do, doing, and done.
Yeah.
Um, and
No
it
more sprints, baby. Tickets can roll over now.
well, oh yes, I've definitely worked with teams who have said, "Can we stop doing sprints? Can we do Kanban instead?" Because that's where people hear that name to start with. But really, what you start to learn with TKP is that Kanban requires a lot more discipline. Scrum gives you rules and says do these things. If you are doing Scrum, then you should be doing these particular events. You've got to set up your schedules and so on. And I think quite a few people will probably think Kanban seems easier. It's just it's Scrum without the without the time box. And certainly, yeah, TKP is a good start point because that sort of brings you into the idea that Kanban's a lot more than just a board. You start by sort of picking up some of the basics of WIP limits. That's something that I think it's a good thing for Scrum teams to be doing anyway. Limit your work in progress. Don't try and take on 20 things at once. Focus on what's important. But there's other parts to Kanban. Trying to remember it was a while ago that I did TKP, and I'm trying to remember whether we actually covered it in depth or just touched on the topics. But there's other parts to it. When you get into KSD, for example, that's kind of the next.
KSD is the next level, which is the Kanban System Design. So
Yeah.
now, like, let me the journey. Pretend I'm the customer, and here's my customer journey. I've been doing Scrum, because somebody told me that's what Agile is, and I've been doing it. I've been maybe even coaching it, and now somebody said, "Hey, we should do Kanban because I hate time boxes." And now we took the TKP, and now we finally get introduced to WIP limits, which I totally agree. I don't see why you need to be on Kanban, quote unquote, to do WIP limits. But fine, you get the ideas of kind of basic ideas of flow and moving things across the board, and not necessarily talking about a particular commitment in a certain period, but more about like how many things did we sort of complete over the last 2 days or 3 days or whatever arbitrary, and we monitor kind of those metrics. Did that team Kanban practitioner, before we go to the Kanban system design, talk a little bit about the metrics and the rigor around metrics that exist, or is that too distant of a memory for you to recall?
It is a bit distant, but it's also quite a short course. I think it's a 1-day course, if I remember rightly.
Okay.
So it really is sort of a general introduction, and you sort of pick up some of the terms, but you certainly don't get into the depth of, how do you interpret flow diagrams and things like that.
Do you remember covering a cumulative flow diagram in TKP?
I don't remember. I would put money on we didn't go into that much depth.
Okay, cool. Okay, I thought so. Okay.
The reliable source for all this information, of course, as you say, is Kanban University. They've got stuff on their website, the flyers of what each course covers, so that will be a lot more reliable than my memory. But yeah, with KSD, you get into a bit more depth. You start thinking about those different pieces of the Kanban system. So yeah, that's where you get a bit deeper into visualization. Like I say, most teams will start with a to-do, doing, done. Okay, let's think about why you would break that down, how you can break that down into more meaningful steps. Yeah, we talked more about the benefits of limiting WIP. There's an exercise, if I remember rightly, where you go through. It's a bit like the coin flipping game, the penny game. That's it. Where you try and do things in a big batch, you do things in a smaller batch, and then you get to single piece flow, which is more effective and why. So
okay, so now we've gone from hey, there's WIP limits now, but there's also sort of batch sizes. We're now talking about batch sizes in
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then
which again, I think sorry to interrupt there, but is again, Scrum teams can adopt that. They don't have to switch to Kanban to benefit from these concepts. So, I'm just trying to tease out that whatever Kanban teaches you, you can still do in Scrum for the pretty much the most part.
Yeah. I mean, Scrumban is kind of it's a vague term, but yeah, there's so much that the two are really, they go together so well. I think it's even on scrum.org, there's a guide as to how to bring Kanban elements into Scrum teams and so on. Trying to think what else is covered in KSD. Or Jerry will be calling me up after this. What did we talk about? Oh, making policies explicit. That's a big one. And again, I mean, that's similar to Scrum teams when you set up working agreements. Make your policies explicit, things that are kind of an unspoken agreement within a team. Well, let's actually write these down and make them clear.
And when we say policies explicit, that sounds like a very kind of like complicated, fancy term, like, oh, policies explicit, But in reality, what that really means just is that when you move things into a particular state or a particular column, the entire team has a clear understanding on what it means to be in that state. What are the things that have been done on the ticket or the work item to be in that state? So everybody's kind of clear, was testing done, or what was a code review done, and that kind of stuff. So again, going back to it, you can still do that in Scrum.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I think that's where your working agreements in Scrum are really useful. And I think the key word for me there was explicit. You as a team, you've already got these agreements, or you think you've got these agreements within the team. And by making them explicit, actually writing them down and putting them somewhere visible, that's when you can have the conversation where people say, oh, I don't remember agreeing to that, or that's okay, great. But you get to a point where you now have an agreement about what does it mean, kind of like definition of done, but at each different step and so on. What does it mean to commit to a work item, to a story? Yeah, and that agreement, that policy should include the product owner, because that it's relating it back to Scrum. Before you bring something into the sprint, you haven't committed to do that work. So that's where your commitment point is, usually for Kanban. It's
And
when
you
you say
mentioned
you've got to start the work.
definition of done there, which
Mhm.
is quite interesting because it's all this pops up a lot. Is it fair to think of it as if you've been using Scrum for a while, you have a DoD, um, uh, and is it fair to say that the sum of all the policies in each of the states or columns equals the definition of done in Scrum? So if you've met the policy requirements for all the things before the last column, add them up together, and that's your definition of done.
Um, hmm, Probably. I think your policies are more than definition are done, but I think, yeah, if your policies cover how work moves across your board and other things you're doing, then yeah, I think it makes sense that your DoD would be equal to or maybe a subset of all your policies. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So and then so now we've gone from covering just WIP limits. Now we're talking about policies, explicit, these kind of things. So then what does the Kanban systems improvement thing do? There's so
So
many, I'm just trying to understand like what's going on here. Because to
yeah,
me, honestly, this is just like one course. Like and a few YouTube videos that you can watch online explaining the CFD. Sell me on the Kanban systems improvement course.
so when you say it feels like it should be one course, it used to be one name. So what the Kanban Management Professional (KMP) used to be. I'm not sure if it was taught as a single course, but it used to be like, well, I guess not, because it used to be KMP1, KMP2, and I don't know, a year or two back, Kanban University renamed them to be KSD and KSI. So there are two closely related courses.
Probably because there's more money to be made by splitting up the certification into multiple certifications and then selling them individually.
I don't
Market
think
segmentation in capitalism, man. That's what's going on here.
I don't think it's any different in that way to what was KMP1, KMP2. But I didn't look at those courses back then. So, but yeah. So talking about how they're structured, KSD, the Kanban System Design, plus the Kanban Systems Improvement (KSI), the two together is what they refer to as the Kanban Management Professional (KMP) certification.
I think somewhere the obviously in Japan and Toyota, and that's the background of this. I feel somebody is turning in their grave right now by looking at the amount of certifications around a pretty simple process improvement concept that is. I'm not saying I think it's good that people are learning about things like WIP limits and flow and batch sizes and throughput and cycle time and all these nice concepts. I just feel that the certification scene is a bit inflated on this. But let's leave the certifications aside for a second. Let's actually talk about the actual Kanban. So now that you've gone through it, I know you and I worked together on some Scrum teams,
Yeah.
which were doing 1 week sprints at the time, and that was that was a lot of fun. How have you what have you learned about Kanban that you can take forward? Or like if you were coaching another team, as a coach, what are some of the things that you might preach or you might emphasize now that you've gained a let's say a medium to thorough understanding of Kanban? How would you change your coaching approach a little bit based on what you've learned?
Yeah, let's say medium, not thorough, because I've learned it. I haven't really had a chance to apply it in depth yet. So I would say I think one of the big things would be starting with a new team. The assumption a lot of the time is start with Scrum, get teams started with Scrum, because it gives that structure and it's simple It's simple, but it's not easy to follow the rules and get those things going. I think understanding more about Kanban system has really helped thinking about maybe that's not the best approach sometimes. You know, if you're in an organization or working with a team that's already got some kind of structure to it, then maybe starting with Kanban is the better way to start. A lot of a lot of what I learned, I think, through the Kanban training and through trying some of this, is it's about evolutionary learning. It's about constant improvement to your process, which Scrum also says, but Kanban stresses it a lot more. And so, you know, starting with a new group, understand where they are and look at where those improvements can come. How can you grow the process that's already there rather than rip it out and replace it with Scrum? So I think that's a big one. I think it's given me a different start point sometimes with teams. And yeah, I think, as we were saying earlier, I think it's working with Scrum teams. Let's say there is a team doing Scrum, and they've got this idea of, well, you know, why don't we do? Can we do WIP limits? Can we remove the sprint time boxes? I think now I've got a much better understanding of, okay, well, what does that mean? What do we have to do? You can't just take those existing things away and leave it with nothing. So what do we replace it with? One of the things in the KSI course that I hadn't come across before are the idea of the cadences that are now documented in the Kanban training. It's not something I come across, but it's similar to the idea of the Scrum events, but it builds up these meetings based on sort of a maturity level.
Oh no! Oh
No,
no!
no, no, no.
Oh no!
No. Yeah, they call it a maturity level, but it's really saying if you're working with a group that are doing A, B, and C, then you might want to think about bringing in D and E as the next step for these things.
Okay.
It's more. I think it's more helpful to a coach or a consultant helping that group.
Mm-hmm.
It's well, in the same way that maturity assessments shouldn't be a stick to beat teams with anyway. But yeah, it's more helpful, I think, in providing guidance as to if you're doing, say, a daily stand-up and you're doing replenishment on demand. So you don't do sprint planning on a 2-weekly cadence as you would do in Scrum. You're doing replenishment, you're building your backlog as you need it. Mm-hmm. Then it sort of suggests here's some next things to look into that you might want to adopt.
You know, and just on that one, and you know, when I work with teams, I also emphasize that again, things you can also do in Scrum, right? Because replenishment, the idea there is instead of like, you know, having this idea of like, you know, having 2 sprints worth of work or 3 sprints worth of work, which, you know, I have my own opinions on what that means. Yeah. And replacing that idea with, hey, we will create our backlog when we are running low on a certain amount of work. Mm-hmm. And that's really the idea. And the main difference is, and it goes back to, I think, batch sizes, is that Scrum sort of almost, because most teams do 2-week sprints, right? Most teams that I've worked with like 1-week sprints. I worked with a 1-day sprint team, a couple, you know, not for too long, but it was quite fun. But Scrum has a tendency where the batch size tends to increase.
Yeah.
Right. And Kanban kind of forces you to think in smaller batch sizes by almost having a mechanism so that you don't over refine or you don't create a big backlog. And I've had like allergic reactions to that idea. Hey, you don't need 3 weeks worth of or 3 sprints worth of work in your backlog because of many reasons which we can get into. So I mean, I always appreciated that Kanban has like a built-in guidance or whatever you will that says keep your batch size low by not over refining.
Yeah, and I think one of the other benefits, I think, of Kanban and thinking about things like, you know, refining on demand when when you need to do it. Is you can extend that Kanban principle, that approach, out from just the development team. So on the product side, they could be doing Kanban as well. They can be following that same, and it all sort of fits together nicely. Trying to work with a product team and say, well, if the dev team's doing Scrum, can you do Scrum? It doesn't really work for
No, yeah,
product
that's a
teams.
great point. That's a
So,
great point. Yeah.
so yeah, you kind of, if you start in the middle with the dev team, you can kind of work outwards and you keep building that whole flow, and that's when you end up with these these wall long Kanban boards that you see sometimes, the obeyers and that kind of idea.
Yeah, no, that's a great point because how often have we seen like another functional group or production support or ops or what have you that sort of come after the software has been deployed and something is happening to the software, yet there's no mechanism for it to kind of go back to the team. But if you have like one flow, it's definitely easier. But of course, creating that flow is difficult and requires greater coordination across more people. So it doesn't come for free, and you need to
Mm-hmm.
really on it. It's not, but conceptually and hypothetically, certainly, I think you get a more end-to-end view of your value creation process than you would in Scrum, which is very much kind of, it starts with, hey, we have decided to build this thing, and this thing is now shipped. Whereas Kanban kind of shifts your focus to something big when done right. That's a great point.
Mm-hmm.
So okay, so we covered sort of like the certification, sort of the new learnings of Kanban. Did these courses kind of do they kind of dive into, hey, this is Kanban, these are the mechanics of Kanban, or do they actually give you some of the theory or some of the quality control aspects on why this was created at Toyota in the first part? I know we're almost always talking about it from a software development perspective, but I've always found that it's helpful to not start at the software part, but start at why this system existed and how it relates to quality control and process improvement. Because sometimes you go Kanban software, Kanban framework, when in my view, and I haven't taken any of these courses, I've always mapped it back to, well, visualization of work, obviously, but the two main things is process improvement and quality, because it emphasizes, it aims to improve both. So these this literature and these courses that are out there, do they go sort of, how much do they go straight into the software part, or how much do they emphasize some of the origin story of Kanban and why it was created and what problems it solved?
We certainly touched on some of the origins, and one of the prerequisites, I think, for all of the courses is David Anderson's the Blue Book, which is no longer blue, I think, in the new version. But there's a whole chapter on him going through a Japanese garden and having that initial idea of the Kanban system that he went on and set up Kanban University. So it kind of talks about that a little bit. I would say I would say a lot of the course, really, we don't think specifically about software development. I mean, we use it as examples, but I think if somebody outside of software development could equally go through that same training, like I was saying, if it's somebody on the product side, there you go, yeah, somebody on the product side, it would find it equally applicable. I think the training, it's useful because it's not tied directly to software development.
Yeah, and I think a very good sort of like partner book or a companion book to the one that you mentioned is Donald Reinertson's Principles of Product Development Flow, which goes much deeper into the ideas of queues and WIP limits and batch sizes and throughput. And it's a bit of a heavy read, just because he's so detailed on the formulas and how to calculate certain things. But there's even if you just skim through that book, or you just pick up read the first 5 chapters or whatever, you really get the idea that how bad high WIP limits are, because as your queue size increases, the side effects of that are made more evident in his writing. And it also talks about my favorite pet peeve, which is the illusion of efficiency that high WIP limits bring, because you get the sense that, oh, we have started 4 projects, or we have started 5 tickets at the same time, or we're on our way, without necessarily realizing that you're celebrating a negative thing. Because by having so many things in process, you're actually hurting everything. And what I like about Reinertson's book is that he makes almost like a mathematical proof on why that's bad. And he gives you examples and across the spectrum, across different cases, on why that just doesn't hold true. Yet, Paul, now that you're equipped with some of this, next time your Scrum Master or your middle manager or your VP goes, start 8 projects, what is your response to that? And they'll say, oh man, let's just start, we'll finish it later, but let's get going on it, because that way everybody's sort of busy, everybody's utilized.
Yeah, busy and utilized, those are the red flag words, aren't they? So yeah, I think there's different ways of showing that multitasking isn't effective. Sometimes it's just as simple as a little diagram that says, well, if we work on 3 things at the same time, the first thing we could get finished is going to take 3 times as long, roughly, because you've only got a third of the effort going into it. So there's partly, there's simple ways of showing just the dividing up your effort means it's going to take longer to finish any one thing, and that's not allowing for all the the context switching and all the other problems, and it also misses out, I think, on what if you're doing those things in parallel, what happens if you learn something from the first one? You're now so far along on projects 2, 3, and 4 that you may not get the benefits of that learning. You focus early, focus on that one and learn from it. If we're not learning from it, why are we doing agile at all?
Yeah, that's true. That's entirely true. And I think we can get into big A agile versus small A agile, but yeah, you kind of hit it on the head. And this podcast is called the Continuous Delivery Podcast, so I've had sort of strong opinions on if you are trying to ship your software continuously to production. I just have found that Kanban is just more useful, just better, just because it sort of detaches you from the time box. And again, of course, you can deploy 10 times a sprint as well. You don't have to necessarily deploy at the end of the iteration. You can deploy during it. But I just like the fact that it just removes that whole time box from the equation entirely and reflects your production deployment as a state instead of something that's aligned to a calendar event. And I know you can deploy multiple times a sprint, but I think it's just helpful to remove that time box as well.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go on.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say about on time boxes. I mean, there are benefits to time boxing, but I've also seen it where it's hurt teams somewhat, because they see that end of sprint as a deadline, and you get that mad panic in the last couple of days to get everything finished. So as much as we try and talk about sustainable pace, what you can sometimes see in a sprint are those peaks of effort towards the end where people are working extra hours because they feel that there's a deadline there.
Yeah. And I honestly find it I've been doing a lot of development lately, and I find it very, very difficult to even predict when I will complete a certain task. It might be 4 hours, it might be 2 days. So if you ask me, hey, can you complete this over the next 2 weeks? There's a high likelihood that I'm going to be undercommitting, if anything, because I'll just pad it and I'll add all the uncertainty into my commitment. Whereas in Kanban, yeah, you're doing some sizing just for figure out the complexity of the work, but you're not committing to a time box. You're just trying to make the work as small as possible, and then you learn from that. So it sort of takes the whole mental gymnastics and math of Does it fit into this window, this hypothetical window that exists? And I think it saves developers a lot of time because they don't have to think about those kind of things. And anytime you get developers thinking about solving the problem rather than figuring out when they will solve the problem, I just think that's positive.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's another thing. You're talking about Scrumban. That's another thing that even as a Scrum team, bring in from Kanban. Measure your cycle time and your throughput. Get rid of all the estimation and rely on the data. And that's kind of was my next step when I was getting started in doing it a few years ago. You use the data that exists to forecast when work will be done, and don't put people on the spot and ask them to come up with a number that you then hold them to.
I couldn't agree more. And over the last 6 months, I've had the chance to again apply the Monte Carlo analysis to forecasting, and it just takes estimation out of the equation completely. I can't imagine spending any time on estimation. You're totally right. I think one of the things it does is it takes the conversation away from estimating to forecasting, right? Yeah. And I think that's, again, a huge positive because now developers don't have to think about, does this fit? Is it small, medium, large? And I totally agree that I think Scrum is good. I also think Scrum is sometimes kind of training wheels. You know, if you're a team that has not delivered frequently or is learning to work together, you need some guardrails, and sort of Scrum definitely provides that. But as a long term, if you're a team that's been together for, I don't know, 5-6 months, I think you kind of owe it to yourself to try a more flow-based system than continuing with the iterative time box.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's been my thinking, and definitely these courses have reinforced it, that going forward it's going to be, if you're a team that's starting to do Scrum, first do Scrum properly and then start pulling in these other parts of from Kanban and other places. I mean, poor old XP always gets overlooked. So
yeah, I mean, XP just had the problem with XP is that it did not have great marketing.
Doesn't have a good name, like, yeah, anyway.
Yeah, extreme. I mean,
yeah,
fundamentalist programming. I don't know. It's got this vibe to it, but yeah, a lot of these things all have XP components to it, except that the XP people never had a certification program, or not to my knowledge. They never really marketed it, which I think I have a lot of respect for them for. But a lot of these concepts all come from XP. And if XP had an MBA on there and a marketing person on there, I think XP would have looked a lot different than it does today. But I'm glad they did.
And yeah, I mean, we've been talking about bringing Kanban things into Scrum. I think that's where teams should end up, is Scrum plus Kanban plus XP, as pull the bits that make sense and put those together. Yeah.
Okay, awesome, Paul. This has been great. I'm glad you've given the audience a good overview of what some of the certifications are, what some of the things you learned from it are, some of the pitfalls of Scrum versus Kanban. I think we all sort of agreed that we've all sort of graduated from Scrum and are now into more flow-based techniques. But at the same time, if you're a new team and just learning to work together, maybe Scrum is a good starting point for you for sure. Paul, thanks again for coming on, man, and hopefully we'll talk to you again soon enough.
Yeah. I just want to do a quick thank you to Jerry Doucette for doing all the training and helping me through all of this. It was really good.
Oh, Jerry, yes, Jerry's great. Jerry and I had a couple of so way back when, and he was always fun. Maybe we'll have him on next.
Yeah, he can correct all the things I've just told you.
Okay, Paul, thanks again for joining. Listener, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you again soon enough. Goodbye.